Tell me about your listening skills, both in listening to your membership and also your listening skills in listening to the employer.
Right.
Have they evolved over a period of time?
Well, probably. If you asked an employer who I worked with, 25 years ago, hopefully I've improved and gotten better at this, because it's a hard process to learn, and it takes time, and I think you get better with experience because you can build on other things you've had happen in the past. But listening is incredibly important. When you're in a representative role, when you're representing someone else, you have to listen to them, because again, it's their job, it's their collective agreement, it's not mine. And so understanding, listening to what they're telling you is really important. But then so is listening to the employer and what they're saying on the other side, and the whole dynamic at the bargaining table. Watching that dynamic is incredibly important. There's a lot of signals, a lot of nonverbal communication. It's important to learn that, see it, pick up on that, and that's how you get an idea, I guess, about really how strong people's positions are in different things, what people really think, and all that. So it's very important.
Would you do a lot of probing when people would voice different things? Would you ask them questions?
Sometimes, yeah, depending on the situation. Sometimes you can draw people out in conversations. Some employers take a position where they have only one spokesperson at the table, and some are quite religious about that, where they'll have one person who does all the talking and they won't let anyone else talk.
Really?
Yeah, there's some like that. And then there's a range where more informal, where people talk, and it's always better if you can get other people talking, because you get a bit of better perspective and assessment rather than one spokesperson who's doing talking. And my practice has always been have your committee talk, because again, they're the ones who live it, they're the ones who work and know it better. And so I always encourage people to talk at the bargaining table on our side. There's nothing too dangerous, I think, that can be said, and I think it's part of having a dialogue and expressing how strongly we feel about different issues.
Where does trust come into play here in the bargaining process? I mean, you said a few moments ago that your personal credibility is quite important in the negotiating process. But if you were to talk about trust, where does that fit in? It
kind of fits in with everything. It's hard to sort of isolate it, but if you don't have trust with the other side, or you don't trust the spokesperson or the main person you're dealing with on the other side, or it just becomes much more difficult to get an agreement, because you don't know if they're manipulating or misleading you. Have you had
situations like that?
Sure, of course.
And what would have happened?
Well, it just makes everything more difficult. You're more likely to end up in a dispute. You're less likely to get an agreement without a dispute. It just makes it more difficult. That's also what I kind of mean when you talk about a mature bargaining relationship, as opposed to an immature one. Immature one, you have gamesmanship and lying, or stupid bluffing and taking ridiculous proposals that everybody knows is ridiculous, but you're doing it just because you can. And a more mature bargaining relationship is when you have much more open and honest discussions about what the real issues are, with a joint kind of problem-solving kind of attitude, where everyone knows you may not agree on everything, and that's fine, but working through the issues you have in front of us. If you can get to that, it's a much better process.
Are you a patient person in the bargaining process?
Probably not. I know people say that that's important in bargaining, and it is to a degree. I mean, it's part of it. I'm not, for me personally, it's probably not something I was the best at. But I care a lot about, who you represent, and you get involved in it, and you want to do something, and you want to have the best possible agreement, because you care for the people you represent, and I can't be unemotional about that.
But you seem to be very fixated on process, educating your members. So it would assume to me that you have to be fairly patient in that process.
Oh, in that process,
and
sure.
listening to people
Sure.
and.
Yes, in that part of the process, yeah.
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 And what about patient with the other side?
Well, that's where I'm probably not, you know, not as not as effective. You should be on the other side too, but no, part of the education in the process for organizing to get ready for bargaining is really the most important part, in my view. What you say at the bargaining table matters, I guess, but it's really the preparation you do ahead of time that matters the most.
Which leads us into the next series of questions in terms of concession strategy.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of focus would you give to your concession strategy going into negotiations?
Okay, you need to explain to me what you mean. What's the context? Can you give me a context?
Well, you're not going to get everything you asked for.
Really?
No. So what do you do?
Okay, so I guess I wouldn't describe that as a concession strategy then. I would describe that more in terms of prioritizing what you want to try to achieve. Realizing
that's
that
a better word.
Yeah, it is.
Prioritizing.
It's a
no
way
concessions
better word.
with our
no,
union.
that's a bad word. But prioritizing, and so it depends on the circumstance. Look, I've had to negotiate agreements where we went backwards. It's just a fact of life. But sometimes there are a lot of difficult times, and depending on the dynamic or the economics of the agreement that you're facing with, there are times that we've had to do that. So it's really about prioritizing. And I think it's always important when you're bargaining to focus on what the employer's positions are and communicate about that with your members during that process. So that, because if unions go in with saying, wow, we're going to fight for a 10% wage increase, all along knowing that that's just not going to happen. You're not going to get a 10% wage increase. Then you got everybody fixated about, oh, we're going to fight for 10%. Then when it goes down to 9 or goes down to 8, then that's a very negative feeling, right? So if you start with the fact that the employer came in with the bargaining table and said, we're going to take away, 5 to 10% off your wages, right? And then we start getting better through the process. That's how I prefer to do it. So we're because that's really what you're talking about, from employer's opening position to where you end up with. Because picking an arbitrary number like, oh, we want a 10% or a 15% wage increase or whatever is kind of an arbitrary process. Art of bargaining is trying to get everything you can for the employees.
But share with us in terms of this prioritization of issues. Would the members fully understand what the priorities are?
Well, that's why you involve them in the whole process to figure out what the priorities are. And not everybody's going to agree. I mean, depending on how big the workplace is, not everybody's going to agree. And people come at it from a different perspective, and so it's just generally getting sort of buy-in and then working with the bargaining committee, who spend the most amount of time in the process, sometimes you have to make hard decisions, about different areas, but trying to sort of be clear on what areas are important for most of the members. So that's part of it.
What's been your experience in terms of impasses and deadlocks?
Mm-hmm.
What sort of things would you advise the novice negotiator that is watching our show in terms of the impasse and the deadlock?
Yeah, I didn't like that strategy too much. I know lots of unions or lots of employers like using that strategy of, lining deadlines up and that kind of thing. And look, and it's useful sometimes. It depends on the dynamic of the relationship. It really does. So I tried to not get involved in that unless you had to, unless it was really had evolved into some kind of pissing match, and there were some fundamental things on the table that you just couldn't deal with, and then you had to get more into that kind of style of bargaining. But I really think that there's a big range of bargaining styles, and I don't know how many sets of collective bargaining I've done, a lot, and they're all different. And they all have different dynamics because they're all different people and they're all different economics and they're all different histories, and each one is different. You can't really, you know,
it's hard to generalize, eh?
It's a little hard to generalize because it depends, and I don't think you should go into bargaining with, this is what we do every time, boom, 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 because that doesn't make any sense. You're dealing with a bunch of humans, and it's...
Tell me about behavior at the table. Are there some do's and don'ts that you think are important, or that you don't like, or that you do like, in terms of actual behavior?
Do's and don'ts, I don't know. We used to try to, I spent a lot of time working with my bargaining committee to try to, you know, prep them on what to sort of do and not do, and I used to usually tell them to really watch the other side, watch the dynamics, keep an eye on them, you know, really pay attention to, you know, nonverbal as well as verbal, but how people were reacting to different things. We would try to organize sometimes ahead of time what kind of key messages we wanted to try to do, try to stay on point, you know, that kind of thing. Otherwise, I don't have a lot of do's and don'ts because...
Would you have a note taker?
Yeah, usually, yeah.
One person?
Yeah,
or two?
usually, it depends, yeah. Usually at least one person taking notes. You need to have a record because sometimes there's a dispute later about what you said or what you intended, and you need your bargaining notes. So
that would be pretty helpful to have those notes. Eh?
Yeah, you need to have it. And also what happens is bargaining can sometimes go over a long process, a long time period. And if you want to go back to earlier meetings to remember, to recall what the flavor of the conversation is and what you talked about, you need to go back and look at it sometimes. So it's helpful to have. So I always took notes myself, and then as well, and then we'd have someone else who would be taking more comprehensive notes. But I wasn't a big verbatim note person because, you know, some people do, but you need to get there. You need to get a record of it though, so in case you need to go back and check.
In your different experiences in terms of being a negotiator, have you used third-party information, testimonials, data collections, experts' opinions? And if so, have you used them often, and were they ever relevant?
I'm not sure what kind of examples you mean by that. I mean, we've certainly... Many times in the past, I've used conciliators or people to come in to help assist if we needed it. Every now and then that's helpful, depending on the kind of dynamic that you have and how good that person is. Sometimes that can be helpful in the process, but not so much. I mean, it depends on how complicated the collective agreement is and the subject matter is, whether you need to have experts on different areas. In the hockey world, the collective agreement is very complicated, and we had different advisors on different key areas because, you know, it's a very complicated collective agreement, but not typically in most of the bargaining that I was involved in before. And sometimes you get legal advice, obviously, on different things.
Oh, we need the lawyers.
Sometimes, not as much as you guys think.
In terms of objective criteria to support your claims, I would think that in your many, many different negotiations that you've had over the years, you would be called to account for your particular claim.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So we do our homework. I mean, we do our homework on things, right? So we would look at other collective agreements in the sector and look at what's going on and what's out there and what's the typical settlements out there in collective agreements. So, of course, we would do all that kind of work because that just either helps you or hurts you. And if it's going to hurt you, you might as well know what it is. So you know what's going on out there.
Would you share that with the other side?
Depends. I mean, it really depends. I mean, if it helps
you,
then of course.
Pardon
right?
me?
If it helped you, of course. So it depends.
Would they share information with you in terms of their claims?
If it helped them, sure. I mean, like I think I said this already, but the conversation actually at the bargaining table is not the most important part. I mean, people say that it is, and that tends to be what the focus is the kind of speech you make or how you present an argument. And frankly, it's one small piece of the bargaining process. It's really a small piece of it.
That's very interesting that you're sharing that with us. I agree with that, but I'm sure a lot of our younger viewers out here wouldn't know that necessarily would be the case.
I think it's counterintuitive, frankly, but it's very complicated. It's a very complicated process. It involves so many different things and elements and history and economics and everything else that it's not about the speech you make at the bargaining table. You can make a great speech and it doesn't really matter. If you're really stirring, maybe it helps your bargaining committee think that, you know,
you're doing a good job.
You're doing a good job, but in the end, the employer doesn't care about the speech you make. It's about power and leverage in the end, and whether you have the support of your members.
Talk about power and leverage. How are you defining that? What sort of commentary would you make on the leverage and on the power? Well,
that's complicated too, like everything is, and it depends. I mean, you have to do a bit of an assessment of how much power you have and what's realistic to achieve in whatever collective bargaining that you're dealing with. And, you know, if the economy is in big trouble and and factories are closing down and people are being laid off and you've got high unemployment, I mean, it may not be the best environment to decide that you're going to make new ground. And if you happen to be the highest paid employer in the region, it's going to be difficult. So you have less power in that situation, and you've got to sort of assess it to help determine what makes sense in terms of what's achievable and what you can do. And then when you're talking with your members or your bargaining committee, they need to understand that too, because it's part of the decision making that goes into the process.
And leverage?
That's, it's connected. Leverage is connected. It's timing. Do you have the employer in a time when they really need to have a collective agreement? Does a dispute or a threatened or a perceived dispute, does that give you any extra leverage because they need to have it done by a certain time? That kind of thing. So it's understanding their side and their pressures and their dynamic, because they've got pressures and dynamic just like on the employee side.
Is it been the tradition, or is it a tradition in terms of your bargaining that you've done over the years? Do you make the first offer, or do you wait for the other side to make the first offer?
Yeah, that's, I think traditionally most unions make the first offer. I was not necessarily an advocate of that. I tried to avoid that if I can.
Can I ask why?
I like to have the employer go in first, and that way you get to see what their issues are, and I like to bargain off their proposals, knowing all along what we're trying to achieve, of course, but bargaining off their proposals is a helpful thing. So it depends.
It depends.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was that the case with the NHL?
Well, on that stuff, because that's really public, I'm not going to go into a lot of details about that. I mean, people can read about it, but it was complicated. It would vary depending on what the issue was.
What's been your experience in terms of multi-party negotiations? Have you? In
terms of multi-employer?
Multi-employer, yes, or multi-union, different memberships of a group?
Yeah, I haven't done multi-union bargaining where we had multiple unions at the bargaining table at the same time. I haven't done that. I think it obviously just raises the degree of complexity and makes the whole organization and preparation job even more difficult, where you need to spend a lot more time, and then trust becomes an issue in terms of working with everyone. I've dealt with some multi-employer situations, which are difficult too, because then there's just different dynamic across the table. And it's important to understand that different dynamic and know who's kind of driving the boat on the other side, and who's got more power and who's the more negative, or is there someone that you can deal with better, and all those dynamics. So it's interesting. It makes it more complicated, and you just have to kind of be aware of all the different dynamics and complexities of the situation that you have.
Time frame would probably be a little bit longer.
Sometimes.
Sometimes?
Yeah. I mean, not necessarily. It would depend. We used to deal with, when I first started bargaining, we had employer associations in the old apparel sector when there was a lot of factories here, when we still had a big manufacturing base in this country. And sometimes they were they didn't necessarily be longer. Like if they were pretty well developed and sophisticated and were well organized, it was fine. Worked through. But just the potential is there to make things more complicated.
In your experience, you've come across a lot of different negotiators.
Yes.
Some on the union side,
Yes.
some on the employer side.
Yes.
Who has struck you as being a top-notch negotiator?
Well, I'm not going to name any names.
Well, give us the characteristics of some of those negotiators then, if you don't care to share the names with poor struggling students.
Let's see, characteristics. Is someone I like to deal with?
Who's a
Or
good
I thought was
negotiator?
good negotiators. I guess I like dealing with people who were experienced enough so they knew what the process was, and you could talk through issues in a constructive way. So good negotiators in a mature, again, assuming you have a mature relationship, are ones that can get through some of them, some of the bullshit in the process, if I can say that word here.
Sure, we've heard it before.
So if I could use that word, there's a lot of bullshit in the process. So if you can clear some of that out and deal with someone, I think that's a good negotiator. Someone who kind of gets what they're trying to achieve and doesn't necessarily do a lot of the gamesmanship. I think the gamesmanship stuff is not necessarily constructive because the other side is going to get it and they're going to know, and you're so much more prone to have a dispute when you do stuff like that. So that's what I think is a good negotiator. I dealt with a lot of lawyers. I liked working with lawyers. I liked working with non-lawyers. It's really people who kind of knew the process and had some experience in the process can become very good negotiators.
Now, in terms of the media, any suggestions or commentary in terms of how the media play? Well, the NHL was one, but in other discussions.
Depending on the situation you have, if you're having a fight with someone, we had lots of fights. You want to put your issues in the public eye because it's sometimes about putting pressure on the employer. So media, the community, public pressure can be an important part of the process depending on what you're doing and where you're at. And if you have a particularly obstinate or difficult employer, or an employer is trying to beat the union or decertify the union, or really anti-union employer, it's important to use public tools, including media, to get your message out. Yeah, but depending on the employer, if they're active in the community or they're trying to sell a product, then that matters. So that can be a part of the process depending on the situation.
Now, you're an experienced person. As you know, this is part of the Ted Rogers School of Management. Many of the students in the Commerce Department will be seeing this particular interview. What would you suggest to those students who are attempting to start off in a career, or who are in a career, wish to change, and to have a good life? What are 3 or 4 things you would suggest to them? Win the lottery.
Well, you spend a lot of your life working, and it's great if you can have a career or a job that you like doing, because you're going to spend a lot of hours doing it. So finding something you like is really important. So I would say a couple of things is that keeping your options open when you're young is important, so that you don't close too many doors in case you decide you don't know what you like, particularly at a young age. And I fell into this. I didn't really plan on doing this. I fell into it.
Really?
And so keeping doors open is important, I think. But it's more difficult for young people today than it was for me and for our generation. I think it's much tougher. And so I think young people today need to have more of a plan. So think about what you want to do. Be more proactive about it. Things just don't happen. You have to make them happen today. And you need relationships. Make them. Be proactive. you know, really engage with people and ask for help and assistance and mentoring, because it's very difficult. And I love helping young people if I can. It makes you feel good, and if you can do that, and I think that's true of a lot of people that would like to do that. So you got to be proactive. You got to be thoughtful about it, and try not to close too many doors early, because you may change your mind what you want to do.
Well, on behalf of the Ted Rogers School of Management, the faculty and the students, I want to express to you our appreciation for joining us on the Ryerson negotiation project, for your insights and your observations and your great suggestions. So
Yeah, no
thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you.
Fun to be here. Thanks.